In a city where glass towers rose like giants of ambition, the ground beneath still carried the memory of ancestral soil. It was a place where modern wealth and old traditions lived side by side, never fully embracing each other, yet never completely separating. The city lights shone bright at night, but beneath that glow were stories of villages, elders, and forgotten roots that still whispered through the wind. People came here chasing success, but many lost pieces of their soul along the way. Among them was a young woman from a distant village, now standing in the heart of this restless city. She carried life within her womb and strength within her silence. Her presence was gentle, like morning rain falling on dry land. Yet in this new world, gentleness was often mistaken for weakness. She walked carefully through the mansion halls, learning how to survive in a place that did not understand the language of kindness she grew up with. Still, she did not bend her spirit. She remembered the teachings of her mother and grandmothers, teachings of patience, dignity, and endurance. One evening, she stood near a large window, watching the city lights flicker like restless fireflies. Her hands rested softly on her belly as she whispered to her unborn child, "My child, the world you are coming into is not always kind. But remember, strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is the silence that refuses to break." Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of generations. Inside the same house lived a man known across cities for his wealth and influence. He was her husband, a billionaire whose name opened doors and silenced rooms. Yet behind his success was a heart shaped by pride. He believed control was power, and emotion was something for the weak. Once, he had admired the simplicity of the woman he married, but as his wealth grew, his heart slowly turned colder. He began to see her not as a partner, but as someone who did not belong in his polished world. One evening, he sat in his grand office surrounded by glowing screens and important documents. A trusted associate spoke to him carefully. "She is from a village, sir. People in your circle question the match." The man leaned back in his chair and replied coldly, "A man is not defined by who he loves, but by what he controls." His words carried confidence, but also distance. Even love, in his world, had become something to measure and test. Inside the mansion, silence carried its own language. The servants, though trained to serve, often reflected the attitude of their master. When they saw the young wife, some would bow slightly, but their eyes lacked warmth. One maid whispered to another while passing her in the hallway, "She walks like someone who does not understand this world." The other replied quietly, "Or maybe this world refuses to understand her." Yet such words remained hidden, spoken only in corners where power could not hear. The family of the billionaire also visited often, their presence filling the house with judgment. They sat in elegant rooms, speaking in polished voices, but their eyes carried cold evaluation. One elder relative once looked at her and said, "She is kind, yes, but kindness does not build empires." No one openly opposed her, but acceptance was never offered either. She was present, yet never fully embraced. Between tradition and modern pride, a silent battle continued within the mansion. The woman represented values of respect, unity, and humility, while the house around her reflected ambition, image, and control. It was not a war of words, but a war of energy, one that could be felt in every glance, every silence, every ignored greeting. She often thought of her village, where elders would say, "A home without warmth is just walls standing together." And in this house, warmth was becoming harder to find. As nights grew longer, she found herself sitting alone in rooms filled with gold decorations and shining furniture. Everything around her spoke of wealth, yet none of it spoke to her heart. One night, she whispered softly to herself, "If this is life in riches, why does my soul feel so poor?" Her voice faded into the silence, unanswered. The mansion remained beautiful on the outside, but inside it carried an emptiness only she could feel. The morning air in the mansion felt heavy, as if even the wind understood that something important was being broken. The husband prepared for his journey to Europe, moving with calm confidence, but his steps carried a deeper meaning, an escape not just from business, but from responsibility itself. Servants hurried around him, lowering their heads, while the house echoed with the quiet tension of a decision that would change everything. The pregnant wife stood nearby, watching him with quiet hope in her eyes, still believing he might show warmth before leaving. But his heart had already traveled far ahead, leaving her behind in silence. Before stepping out, he turned to her briefly. His expression was firm, almost distant, as if he was studying something he no longer understood. In a calm voice, he said, "I am going to Europe. I will be away for some time." She nodded softly and asked, "How long will you be gone?" But he gave no clear answer, only a look that felt colder than his words. Then, as if proving a point only he understood, he placed only $20 on the table. In a house of great wealth, that small amount felt like a stone dropped into a river of gold. She stared at the money in disbelief and asked quietly, "Is this all for me?" He replied without emotion, "Let us see what strength truly means. Survive without depending on me." His words were not care, but a challenge shaped by pride and doubt. A nearby servant lowered her gaze and whispered, "Even the strongest tree is not asked to grow without soil." But no one dared speak louder. In that house, silence obeyed power. After he left, the mansion changed as if a spirit had been removed from it. The warmth disappeared first, followed by respect. Servants who once spoke politely now moved with indifference. Requests were delayed, meals arrived late, and her presence slowly became something they ignored. It was not open cruelty, but quiet neglect, the kind that slowly breaks the heart without leaving visible wounds. One maid whispered while passing her, "Without the master, she is just another shadow here." Another replied softly, "A house that forgets kindness forgets its soul." But these words never reached her openly. She only felt the change in how people looked at her, as if she had become invisible in her own home. Yet she did not cry out. She did not insult or fight. Instead, she carried her pain in silence, just as the women of old stories were taught by their mothers and grandmothers. Her eyes often looked distant, but her heart remained steady, holding on to dignity even when respect was taken away. She remembered her mother's voice from the village, soft but strong. A woman's strength is not always in her voice. Sometimes it is in what she survives without breaking. And so, when the final day came and the gates of the mansion closed behind her, she stood alone outside. The wind moved gently around her, as if unsure whether to comfort her or witness her fall. One hand rested on her unborn child, and her eyes looked forward into a world that had suddenly become uncertain. No one called her back. No one stopped her. Only silence stood with her at the gate of fate, as her new journey began in the shadow of abandonment. The morning the gates of the mansion opened, there was no warning, no farewell filled with warmth, only silence that cut deeper than words. The pregnant woman stood inside the grand house that once promised her safety, now turned into a place of quiet rejection. Servants moved past her without meeting her eyes, following the unspoken command of their master. No one spoke, but their behavior said everything. She was no longer wanted here. As she was gently but firmly guided toward the exit, she held her belly and walked slowly, feeling each step like a piece of her heart falling behind her. When she finally stepped outside, the heavy gate closed behind her with a loud iron sound, like a final judgment written by fate itself. The sound echoed in her chest more than in her ears. In that moment, the world she had known vanished completely. The air outside felt different, colder, harsher, and full of unfamiliar noise. Cars rushed past, people walked without looking, and the city seemed to swallow her presence without care. She stood still for a moment, trying to understand how a place so bright could feel so empty. With no direction and nowhere to go, she began walking into the forgotten corners of the city. The roads became narrower, the buildings older, and the faces around her heavier with struggle. Here, life was not polished like the mansion. It was raw, loud, and difficult. She saw people fighting to survive each day, carrying burdens on their heads, in their hands, and in their eyes. The difference between her past life and this new world hit her like a painful truth. Fear slowly crept into her heart as she realized she was truly alone, without protection or identity. In her hand, she still held the $20 her husband had left her. She looked at it again and again, as if trying to understand its meaning. Each note felt like a question she could not answer. Should she buy food, or save it for shelter? Should she trust the next hour, or fear the next day? The money was too small to carry hope, yet too important to ignore. It became both a burden and a lifeline, reminding her that she had been tested, not cared for. And in that silence, she finally understood the depth of her abandonment. As she walked, her thoughts drifted back to the stories her village elders once told her under moonlight. She remembered how they spoke of women who survived droughts, betrayals, and loss without losing their dignity. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind, "A woman's strength is not measured by what she receives, but by what she survives without breaking." Slowly, something inside her began to shift. Pain was still there, but beneath it, a quiet strength started to rise like fire under ashes. She straightened her back, holding on to the belief that survival itself was a form of victory. After hours of wandering, she reached a small settlement hidden between old buildings and dusty paths. Life here was simple, but not empty. Women worked together, shared food, and cared for each other like family. When they saw her condition, they did not ask for her status or past. One woman gently said, "Sister, you look tired. Come and rest." Those simple words broke something inside her, not in pain, but in relief. For the first time since leaving the mansion, she felt human warmth again. Slowly, she was given a place to sit, then a place to stay. The women around her became strangers only in name, because their kindness quickly turned them into family. In this humble community, she found something wealth could never give her, belonging. And as night began to fall over the city, she realized that even after being cast out of a golden cage, life still had small corners where hope could quietly begin again. In the days that followed, the woman who once lived behind golden gates began a new life from nothing. With no support from the world she came from, she slowly started small survival work in the humble settlement. She prepared simple homemade food and small crafts with her own hands, sitting under the open sky where the sun became both witness and companion. Her work was not fast or easy, but every effort carried deep determination. As she served food or sold small handmade items, she whispered to herself, "Even a seed buried in hard soil will one day find light." Each small earning she received was not just money, it was hope returning piece by piece. Through all this, she never allowed her dignity to fall. Even in hardship, she carried herself like a woman who still remembered who she was. But life outside the mansion did not remain silent. The news of her fall spread through the neighborhood like wind through dry grass. Some neighbors gathered in small groups, whispering behind her back. "She trusted a rich man and lost everything," one said. Another added, "Luxury blinds women, this is the result." Yet not all voices were cruel. Some women looked at her quietly and said, "Look at her, she does not cry, she does not beg. There is strength in her silence." She heard all of it, but she chose not to respond. She remembered an old village saying, "When mud is thrown at a strong tree, the tree does not move, it simply waits for the rain." So she kept working, kept living, and let her silence protect her dignity from becoming their entertainment. There were moments, especially in the quiet nights, when pain whispered to her heart. She would think of the mansion, of the comfort she once knew, and for a brief moment, temptation would rise like a soft shadow. A voice inside her would ask, "Should I return? Should I ask for forgiveness, even if I was the one abandoned?" But every time that thought came, another voice, stronger and deeper, would rise within her. It was the voice of self-respect. She would gently place her hand on her belly and say, "No, I will not beg for a place where I was made to feel invisible." Her pride was no longer arrogance, it was survival of the soul. And so, she refused to return, even when loneliness tried to weaken her heart. As days turned into weeks, something began to change in her life. Her small efforts slowly started to grow. The food she cooked became trusted by many in the community. The crafts she made began to sell more often. People started noticing her honesty, her patience, and the quiet strength she carried in every action. She never cheated anyone, never spoke badly about others, and never showed bitterness despite her past. Because of this, trust grew around her like a protective circle. People began saying, "She is not just a woman who suffered, she is a woman who rose." With time, her name became known in the community not as someone who fell, but as someone who rebuilt herself from broken pieces. She was invited to small gatherings, asked for advice, and treated with respect. Her past no longer defined her shame, it became her strength. The same people who once whispered now said openly, "She is a symbol of resilience." And though she never sought attention, life itself placed her gently into a position of honor born from hardship. But even as respect grew around her, her body carried its own struggle. As her pregnancy advanced, physical pain became stronger, and some days were harder than others. She would wake up tired, her body aching, yet she still continued her work with quiet determination. Emotional loneliness sometimes visited her like a silent visitor at night, reminding her that she was still alone in many ways. But the women of the community began to stand beside her. They brought her food, helped her rest, and stayed with her during difficult moments. One woman told her softly, "You are not alone here anymore. We are your family now." And in that simple truth, she began to understand something powerful, that unity among women could turn suffering into strength, and isolation into shared survival. Far away in Europe, the husband moved through a world of glass buildings and endless luxury. He closed major business deals with powerful men, his name respected in every room he entered. Yet inside him, there was a silence he could not explain. He sat in expensive restaurants, looked out at families laughing together, children running into their parents' arms, and for a brief moment, something inside him shifted. But pride quickly covered it. He would shake his head and tell himself, "Feelings do not build empires." Still, even as he said this, a quiet emptiness began to grow inside his heart like a shadow he could not escape. Back in the humble settlement, the woman's time had come. The air was heavy with pain and urgency as she went into labor. There was no luxury bed, no doctors of high status, only the simple space of a modest home and the strong hands of community women who stood beside her. One woman held her hand tightly and said, "Breathe, sister. Pain is a visitor, not a home." Another wiped her sweat and whispered, "You are stronger than the storm inside you." Each moment of pain tested her, but she did not break. Her cries echoed through the room, but so did her courage. It was as if the ancestors themselves were standing beside her, watching her endurance with silent pride. After long hours of struggle, the child finally arrived. A cry filled the room, sharp and pure like a new beginning. Tears filled the woman's eyes, not just from pain, but from relief and overwhelming strength. One of the women smiled and said softly, "A new life has entered the world, and so has a new strength in you." In that moment, something changed within her. She was no longer the same woman who once stood trembling outside the mansion gates. She had been shaped by pain, and now she stood reborn through it. She held her child close, her hands shaking but her heart steady. The suffering of the past no longer defined her. Instead, it became the ground she had walked over to reach this moment. She looked at her baby and whispered, "You will not grow under fear. You will grow under strength." Her identity was no longer tied to the man who abandoned her. It was now rooted in her survival, her courage, and the life she had brought into the world alone. As days passed, the story of her journey began to spread quietly through the community. People spoke of the woman who was cast out but never broken, the woman who gave birth in hardship but rose with dignity. Her name became a symbol of strength and hope. Traders in nearby areas began sharing her story, saying, "She is proof that even a fallen woman can rise like the morning sun." She did not seek fame, but her resilience traveled farther than she ever could. Slowly, those stories crossed borders, carried by voices and whispers until they reached distant lands. One of those whispers finally reached the ears of her husband. At first, he did not believe it. He frowned and said, "That cannot be her. She was left with nothing." But as more stories arrived, describing her strength, her independence, and her new life, something inside him began to shift. Curiosity turned into discomfort. Confidence slowly cracked beneath uncertainty. For the first time in a long while, doubt entered his mind like an unwelcome guest. He sat alone in his luxury room and murmured, "What has become of her?" And in that question, a silent warning of consequences began to rise within him. Unable to ignore it, he made a decision. He would return. As he prepared his journey back home, pride once again covered his unease. He told himself, "She will be the same. Weak. Waiting. Dependent." In his mind, he imagined her standing at the gate, broken and desperate, waiting for his approval and return. He believed he would see the result of his test, not realizing that life had already written a different story. With confidence in his heart and blindness in his judgment, the billionaire boarded his flight back home, unaware that the world he left behind no longer belonged to the version of himself he remembered. When the billionaire returned to his mansion, he stepped out of his car with the same pride that once made men lower their heads in respect. But the moment his feet touched the ground, something felt wrong. The air was too still, too heavy, as if the house itself had stopped breathing. He walked inside expecting to hear footsteps, greetings, or at least the familiar presence of life. Instead, he found emptiness. The grand halls that once echoed with movement now stood cold and silent, like a forgotten shrine. Even the golden decorations seemed dull, as if they had lost their meaning without the warmth of those who lived there. He called out sharply, "Where is everyone?" His voice echoed through the mansion, but no answer came. The servants who finally appeared did not meet his eyes. They bowed their heads slightly, their hands trembling, as if afraid of the question itself. One by one, they avoided him, and in that avoidance, he felt something unfamiliar rising inside him: confusion. The authority he once carried so easily now felt like it was slipping through his fingers like sand. His anger grew as he demanded answers again, louder this time. "Where is my wife?" he asked. Silence followed for a moment too long before one of the older servants finally spoke in a low voice. She left, sir. Many days ago. She has not returned." The word struck him harder than any insult. He stepped back slightly, his confident posture breaking for the first time. "Left?" he repeated slowly, as if the word did not belong in his world. The servants nodded, unable to continue further. In that moment, something inside him cracked. Shock replaced pride, and confusion replaced control. He tried to understand what they were saying, but his mind refused to accept it. She had nothing. How could she leave? He whispered to himself. For the first time in his life, uncertainty entered his heart like a silent stranger. The idea that she had survived without him, that she had moved on, began to disturb him deeply. A sense of urgency rose inside him, no longer the calm control he once had, but fear mixed with disbelief. Without wasting time, he left the mansion again, this time not as a man of control, but as a man searching for answers. He moved from the polished streets of wealth into crowded, unfamiliar parts of the city. The roads became rougher, the faces around him harder, life more real. Each step he took away from his world felt like a punishment he did not yet understand. The comfort of wealth no longer protected him, it only reminded him of what he had lost. For the first time, he walked not as a ruler of space, but as someone trying to find his way through the consequences of his own choices. As he entered poorer neighborhoods, he began speaking to people he would once never notice. "Have you seen a woman, young, pregnant?" he asked again and again. Some shook their heads, others looked at him with suspicion. But slowly, pieces of truth began to appear. "She worked hard here," one woman said. "She never begged. She survived on her own." Another added, "She became strong, stronger than most of us." Each word felt like a stone placed on his pride, heavy and unmovable. With every story, he realized something painful. She had rebuilt her life without him. She had not waited, not broken, not returned. And that truth began to destroy the image he once had of control. His pride, once unshakable, now began to fall quietly within him. The more he listened, the smaller he felt. The world he ignored was now teaching him lessons he could not escape. And yet, he continued forward, as if guided by something stronger than him. Eventually, he reached a place that looked nothing like his world. It was a modest community filled with life. Children ran freely, women worked together, and people greeted each other with warmth that did not depend on wealth. Laughter filled the air, soft and real, replacing the silence he was used to. For a moment, he stood still, watching it all. This place felt foreign, yet strangely powerful. It was not built with gold or glass, but with something he had long forgotten: human connection. And deep inside, he felt a truth beginning to rise, one he was not ready to face. When he finally saw her again, it felt as if the ground beneath his feet had changed its story. She stood among the people of the community, no longer hidden, no longer broken, but strong in a way he had never imagined. The same woman he once left with nothing now carried herself with quiet confidence. Her head was held high, her steps calm and steady, as if every hardship she had survived had shaped her into something unshakable. Beside her stood her child, healthy and full of life, a living symbol of everything she had endured and overcome. The people around her treated her with respect, listening when she spoke, smiling when she passed, as if she had always belonged there. From a distance, the man stood frozen. His eyes refused to believe what they were seeing. The world around him seemed to slow down, as if time itself was forcing him to understand the truth. "No, this cannot be her," he whispered to himself. But deep inside, he knew it was. The woman he had once tested, once abandoned, had not only survived, she had grown beyond the pain he gave her. In that moment, something inside him cracked. His pride, his control, his belief that she would always remain weak, all of it collapsed at once. For the first time, he felt the weight of his own mistake, and regret entered his heart like a deep wound that could not be hidden. He tried to step forward, but his feet felt heavy. The power he once carried so easily no longer belonged to him. She did not rush toward him. She did not call out. She simply stood, calm and firm, as if his presence no longer defined her world. The balance between them had changed completely. He was no longer the man of authority, and she was no longer the woman who depended on him. Now, she stood whole on her own, while he stood uncertain, stripped of the pride that once shaped his life. Between them, silence filled the space like a heavy storm that refused to fall. No words were spoken, yet everything was said. His eyes carried regret, guilt, and a deep pain he could not hide. He wanted to speak, to ask for forgiveness, to explain himself, but his voice failed him. He realized that some wounds cannot be healed by words alone. She looked at him calmly, her expression steady, carrying neither hatred nor weakness, only peace. That peace frightened him more than anger ever could. In that silence, life itself seemed to speak. His past choices stood before him like invisible judges. He had once believed power came from wealth and control, but now he understood something different. Life had simply returned what he had given. The loneliness he created had come back to meet him. The pride he built had turned into his punishment. It was not punishment from others, but from the natural balance of life itself. As an old saying from the elders goes, a man who plants thorns must learn to walk carefully when the field grows back. And yet, in the middle of his downfall, something else was rising. She stood as proof that strength was never in his hands to give or take. She had been broken, yes, but not destroyed. She had suffered, but she had also grown. The hardships that were meant to end her had instead shaped her into someone stronger than before. The truth became clear like morning light after a long night. True strength was never in wealth or control, but in endurance, dignity, and the will to rise again after every fall. In that moment, the story of both their lives was written not in gold or power, but in the quiet victory of a woman who refused to break. He returned to the place he once ruled with pride, but now his steps carried a different weight. The mansion gates opened slowly, as if even the iron remembered his past mistakes. The man who once walked with authority now entered with a quiet heart full of regret. His eyes searched the empty halls, and for the first time, the silence did not feel respectful, it felt like judgment. The pride he once carried like a crown now felt broken in his hands. He whispered softly to himself, "What have I done to this home, and to her?" No one answered, but the silence itself felt alive. Servants moved carefully around him, no longer afraid of his power, but uncertain of his mood. He tried to speak with authority again, but his voice no longer carried the same strength. Instead, it trembled with something unfamiliar, pain. Slowly, he began to change. He started asking questions gently, listening more than speaking, as if learning a language he had once ignored, the language of respect. One evening, he stood alone in the courtyard and said to a servant, "Tell me, how did she survive?" The servant replied carefully, "Sir, she did not just survive. She grew." Those words stayed in his heart like a deep lesson. He began to understand something painful yet true. Money could build houses, but not heal hearts. He started acting differently, helping quietly, speaking less, and observing more. His pride, once loud like a roaring drum, slowly became soft like distant rain. But the woman he once abandoned did not rush to forgive him. She carried her pain like a river carries stones, quietly, but strongly. When he tried to speak to her, she only looked at him calmly and said, "Some wounds do not close with words." Her voice was not angry, but firm. She remembered every night she cried alone, every step she took without support, and every moment she rebuilt herself from nothing. So she chose silence over rushed emotions, protecting her dignity like sacred ground. She told herself, a broken trust must learn to walk again slowly. In her heart, she began to think deeply about her future. Standing under the soft evening sky, she held her child and whispered, "Do I rebuild what was broken, or do I walk forward alone?" She understood now that she was no longer the woman who once depended on someone else's world. She had become her own foundation. Independence was no longer something forced upon her, it had become her strength. And that strength gave her the power to choose without fear. Meanwhile, the man continued his slow journey of change. Pain had become his teacher. He no longer saw wealth as victory, but responsibility. He learned to listen to elders, to respect those he once ignored, and to understand that being a husband and a father was not about control, but care. His transformation was not loud or quick, it was quiet, like a seed growing under the earth where no one could see it, but change was still happening. Yet the final path between them remained unwritten. The village elders used to say, "A river may return to its source, or it may choose a new path to the sea." In the same way, their story had no fixed ending yet. Forgiveness was possible, but not guaranteed. Reunion was a question, not an answer. Or perhaps she would continue forward alone, building a life shaped only by her own strength. And so, the story remained open, reminding all who heard it that every choice carries its own destiny, and every heart must live with what it decides. In the quiet gathering of the community, the elders sat under the shade of an old tree, where stories were often turned into wisdom. One elder, with a voice deep like distant thunder, spoke slowly, "My children, listen well. True wealth is not the gold a man carries in his hands, but the character he carries in his heart." The people listened in silence as he continued, "A man may build towers of stone, but if his heart is weak, those towers will one day stand alone in emptiness." Another elder added gently, "Pride is like a fast river. It builds power quickly, but it destroys everything in its path if not guided by humility." The woman stood among them, holding her child close, as the words settled into her heart. She understood now that her journey had not been only about pain, but about becoming. The elder looked toward her and said, "And you, child of struggle, remember this, humility opens doors that pride has closed." She bowed her head slightly, not in weakness, but in respect for the truth she had lived through. The village children watched her with admiration, as if her life itself had become a lesson passed from one generation to another. The story of pride, loss, and growth now lived in her silence and strength. As time passed, she no longer felt like a broken woman trying to survive. She stood as someone rebuilt by hardship, shaped by endurance, and guided by wisdom. Her past no longer weighed her down. Instead, it stood behind her like a shadow that reminded her how far she had come. The community no longer saw her as someone abandoned, but as someone chosen by life to rise above suffering. She became living proof that dignity can survive even the deepest betrayal. One evening, as the sun set gently over the land, she stood with her child in her arms, looking across the place that had become her home. People around her greeted her with respect, not because of wealth or status, but because of her journey. A woman nearby whispered, "She is not just a survivor, she is hope itself." Her child reached out, and she smiled softly, holding that tiny hand as if holding the future itself. In that moment, she was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had become. Strong, independent, respected. Her story moved through the community like a gentle wind, reminding others that even the deepest pain can grow into strength. She stood as a living symbol of hope, proof that life, even after breaking someone, can also rebuild them into something greater than before.